Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Unseen Battle. Esther Wallace had always been the first to rise in the mornings, a habit she had cultivated over the years of working in a demanding and often unforgiving environment. As she stepped out of her car that crisp morning, the weight of the day ahead already pressing on her shoulders, she couldn't shake the familiar feeling of weariness that clung to her. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot of the FBI headquarters. It was a place that had become both a sanctuary and a battleground for Esther over the past 15 years. Her body ached from the long hours she had just spent on an undercover operation. She had been in the field all night, gathering vital evidence that would dismantle a major drug syndicate. Despite the exhaustion, a small smile played on her lips. She had always prided herself on her ability to perform under pressure, to navigate dangerous waters with grace and precision. Today, though, was different. Her pride in the success of the operation couldn't completely dispel the quiet, lingering exhaustion that threatened to consume her. As she walked towards the entrance of the building, Esther's mind wandered. She thought about the complexities of her job, the thrill of the chase, and the constant battle to prove herself. Being one of the few black women in the FBI had never been easy. She had fought for every promotion, for every moment of respect she had earned, and she had done so with resilience that no one could deny. Yet, even now, despite her accomplishments and status as one of the agency's top agents, she still encountered the sting of prejudice. It was a pain she had learned to compartmentalize over the years, to bury deep in the recesses of her mind whenever she set foot in the office. But some days, the weight of it all felt too heavy to ignore. The whispers, the sideways glances, the doubt that followed her like an unwelcome shadow, she had become numb to it, or so she thought. On mornings like this, when she was tired to the bone and looking forward to a quiet moment to decompress, it all seemed too much. Esther shook her head, trying to shake off the sense of fatigue that clung to her. She knew she had a job to do. That was what had kept her going all these years. She was good at what she did. In fact, she was damn good. She had earned every ounce of respect she had, and no one, not even the small-minded prejudices she encountered so often, could take that away from her. She took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders, pushing the doubts aside. She had seen the darker sides of the world, and it had only strengthened her resolve. No matter what anyone thought, Esther Wallace was a force to be reckoned with. As she approached the side entrance of the building, she spotted a security guard standing near the doors. The guard, a white officer named Henry Mitchell, was scanning the area with a rigid posture that spoke of his deep commitment to his role. Esther had seen him around before, but never had she noticed anything particularly striking about him until today. Henry's gaze fell on her as she neared the entrance, his expression immediately hardening. It was an almost imperceptible shift, a change in his demeanor that made Esther pause for a brief moment. She couldn't place it, but something about him seemed off. She continued walking toward the door, dismissing the feeling as a fleeting thought. However, as she reached for the handle, Henry's voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, stepping into her path. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Esther blinked, startled. Her brow furrowed slightly as she turned toward him, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Agent Esther Wallace," she said, her voice steady but tinged with surprise. She reached into her pocket, pulling out her badge and holding it up for him to see. "I've just returned from an undercover operation." Henry's eyes narrowed as he took the badge from her hand, turning it over in his fingers, inspecting it with a level of scrutiny that felt both unnecessary and invasive. Esther stood silently, waiting for him to acknowledge what was plainly before him. "This doesn't look like a standard issue badge," Henry muttered, his tone dismissive. He paused for a moment, still staring at the badge, as though the fact that it had been issued by the FBI was somehow not enough. Esther's heart sank, a familiar pang of frustration tightening her chest. She had faced this kind of treatment many times before, being questioned, doubted, dismissed based on her appearance. It never got easier. She forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to remain calm in the face of his growing scrutiny. I assure you, Officer Mitchell, she said, her voice firm, that badge is genuine. I'm an FBI agent. I've been one for 15 years. Henry's gaze flicked from the badge to Esther, and she felt a chill settle in her chest as he took in her appearance. She wasn't wearing her usual crisp suit or formal attire. She was dressed casually, a reflection of the undercover mission she had just wrapped up. You don't look like an FBI agent, Henry said, his words flat, almost accusatory. Esther's breath caught in her throat. The words stung more than she had anticipated. She had been through so much to earn her place in the agency, every promotion, every breakthrough, had been hard-won. To have her authority questioned so casually, so publicly, was a blow she hadn't prepared for. I understand your concern, officer, Esther said, her voice steady, despite the unease bubbling inside her. But I'm a senior agent with the FBI. I'm not here to cause trouble. I've just finished a dangerous operation, and I'm heading back to the office to report in. Henry wasn't convinced. His posture remained rigid, his eyes scanning her face for some hint of doubt. Well, I'm going to need to verify this, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Can't be too careful these days. You understand, right? Esther nodded, though inside, her frustration began to boil over. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the onlookers starting to gather, whispering among themselves. Her eyes flicked around, and she saw a few of her colleagues, some who had known her for years, watching with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. The longer this dragged on, the more the humiliation seeped in. She was a seasoned agent, a woman who had dedicated her life to upholding the law, and here she was, being treated like an outsider, like she didn't belong. It wasn't just about the badge, it was about the silent message he was sending with every word, every movement. As Henry reached for his radio, ready to verify her credentials, the crowd around them began to grow. Esther could feel the stares, the judgment in the air. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. This was turning into something bigger. Something far more painful. Officer Mitchell, Esther said, her voice tight but controlled, I've shown you my badge. I'm an FBI agent, and I'm asking you to step aside. But Henry remained firm, his expression unyielding. I'm just doing my job, ma'am, he said, his words ringing in the air like a challenge. Everyone has to follow protocol. Esther's heart began to race, and for a brief moment, she felt herself falter. Was this really happening? Was this the reality she had worked so hard to overcome? The crowd around them continued to grow, whispers and murmurs filling the air. It felt like a spotlight was on her, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the public humiliation she was enduring. Henry's voice broke through the tension again, his words cutting deep. You don't look like an FBI agent, he repeated, louder this time. And until I can verify your identity, you'll need to comply with my instructions. Esther's cheeks flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. She had always known that there would be obstacles in her career, barriers to break, prejudices to confront, but never had she imagined something so public, so blatant. Just as she felt the emotional weight becoming unbearable, a voice broke through the tension. What in the world is going on here? The crowd parted as Agent Santos, her superior officer, approached with a determined stride. The sense of relief Esther felt upon seeing him was overwhelming, but it did little to ease the sting of what had just transpired. Santos took in the scene before him, his eyes narrowing as he addressed Henry. Would you care to explain why you're detaining one of my top agents? Santos asked, his voice sharp, filled with authority. Esther stood there, still, trying to regain her composure. Henry stood frozen, the weight of his actions slowly sinking in as the realization of his mistake took root. The tension grows. The day after the incident with Henry Mitchell lingered heavily in the air for Esther Wallace. The sting of the public humiliation still gnawed at her, and as she entered the FBI headquarters the following morning, she felt the eyes of her colleagues on her. Some were sympathetic, some were curious, and others, like always, were aloof, pretending nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Esther entered the building with her usual confidence, but inside, the weight of the moment felt suffocating. The encounter with Henry had exposed something deeper than just his prejudice. It was the stark reminder of how often she had been dismissed in her career, not just as a woman of color but as a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated agency. For years, Esther had fought battles silently, each small indignity piling up until it became a towering burden she could never fully escape. Walking past the security desk, Esther saw Henry at his post. His expression was unreadable as he looked up from his paperwork and made eye contact with her. He didn't say anything, but she could tell from the subtle shift in his body language that he knew the gravity of what had happened. The shame was palpable, and though she longed for an apology, she wasn't sure she could accept it. Esther pushed the thought aside as she moved toward the elevator. She had a job to do. She had been in the field for nearly 15 years, and her years of hard work, the sacrifices she had made, and the lives she had changed were what defined her, not the ignorance of one security officer. But still, the seeds of doubt that had been planted by his actions gnawed at her. By the time Esther reached her office, she was already mentally preparing herself for the day ahead. The case file on her desk, a high-stakes operation involving a series of break-ins targeting black-owned businesses in the area, offered a welcome distraction. The gravity of the case pulled her in, offering the clarity she needed to push through the emotions that still lingered from the confrontation. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message from Agent Santos. "Esther, can we meet in 20? I have something for you." She frowned slightly at the brevity of the message, but shook it off. Santos was her superior and had always treated her with respect. Still, the idea of being in another room with him felt like a lifeline. Perhaps it would be easier to deal with the case at hand with a colleague at her side, someone who understood the challenges she faced every day. As she gathered her notes, Esther thought back to the words Henry had said the day before, "You don't look like an FBI agent." She wasn't sure if it was the phrasing or the implication that stung more. But she was certain of one thing: Henry had undermined her professional identity in front of everyone who mattered. She had built her career on her skills, her dedication, her integrity. How could one man's prejudice erase that? Minutes later, she arrived at the conference room, where Santos was already waiting. His expression was neutral, but his eyes softened when he saw her. "Esther, I wanted to check in," he said as she sat down. "How are you doing? I know things got heated yesterday." Esther took a deep breath and forced a smile. "I'm managing. The case is my focus right now." Santos nodded, but there was a concern in his eyes that Esther couldn't shake. He was well aware of the toll the incident had taken on her, but he had never been one to press for personal details. He respected her boundaries. "I understand," he said, opening a manila folder. "But if you ever need to talk, my door is always open." He paused, locking eyes with her. "I hope you know that what happened yesterday wasn't a reflection of the agency as a whole. There are some isolated individuals who still need to learn respect. You're an exceptional agent, Esther." The sincerity in his voice, coupled with his recognition of her work, made her feel slightly better. But there was a part of her that questioned whether words of comfort could truly make a difference. How could anyone understand the emotional weight she carried, the quiet frustrations that simmered beneath her professional exterior? The meeting shifted focus as Santos handed her the case file. "We're dealing with a group that's been targeting black-owned businesses in the city. Vandalism, theft, and outright intimidation. It's become a serious issue, and I think your expertise is needed on this one." Esther glanced over the file, her mind momentarily absorbed by the task at hand. As the team went over the details, Esther's attention wavered between the case and her lingering thoughts about Henry. But when the conversation turned to potential suspects, she found herself more engaged, the need to focus on justice overpowering the emotional residue of yesterday. Meanwhile, Henry sat in the security office, replaying the confrontation in his mind. His hands shook as he pored over reports, trying to focus on his work. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about Esther's face, her frustration, her dignity shattered by his actions. That moment had been a wake-up call, and he had spent the night reflecting on his actions and what they said about him. It wasn't just about the mistake he made in that instant, It was about the prejudices he had never consciously acknowledged. He had judged Esther not based on her capabilities but based on an assumption shaped by his own biases. But in the silence of the office, Henry couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt that weighed heavier than anything he had ever experienced. The consequences of his actions were unclear, but one thing was certain: he had wronged someone who had every right to be in that building, someone who had worked tirelessly to get to where she was. And in a way, he had forced her to relive the systemic injustices she had probably encountered too many times before. Henry had spent the morning wrestling with the shame he felt. He wasn't sure what to do with it. Apologies were easy, but they didn't undo the damage. What could he say to make things right? Would an apology even be enough to fix what he had done? He had no idea. But one thing was certain: the shame he felt was a reminder that even well-intentioned people could harbor deep-seated prejudices. When Henry arrived home that evening, the weight of the day pressed down on him. He went straight to the couch, staring blankly at the television. His mind was elsewhere, on the hurt he had caused, on the systemic issues within the agency that he had never fully acknowledged. He had never seen himself as a racist, never thought of himself as someone who harbored prejudices. Yet, the events of the past 24 hours made him realize how easily his assumptions had clouded his judgment. As the days passed, Esther found herself in a delicate balance between her professional pride and the bruising emotional toll of her encounter with Henry. Each day was a mix of work and reflection. She focused on the case file, worked with her team, and did everything in her power to make sure the criminals responsible for the attacks on Black-owned businesses were brought to justice. But beneath the surface, the sting of public humiliation still lingered. At the same time, Henry struggled with his own feelings of regret. His actions had been an assault on Esther's dignity, and he couldn't shake the image of her standing there, fighting to maintain her composure. He knew he had to find a way to apologize, but how could he make it right? Neither Esther nor Henry knew how things would unfold from here. The tension between them simmered, but for now, they both had work to do. And sometimes, work was the one thing that could distract from the emotions that swirled beneath the surface. The turning point. The following week passed in a blur of case files, strategy meetings, and briefings, but Esther could still feel the quiet storm brewing inside her. The episode with Henry Mitchell hadn't just been a personal affront, it had stirred up a deeper, more systemic sense of isolation that she had spent years burying under professionalism and grit. Even in the midst of urgent investigations, Esther found herself reflecting on how, despite all her accomplishments, she was often reduced to the color of her skin in the eyes of others. That morning, she sat at her desk, staring at her computer screen, but her mind was elsewhere. She had just been handed a new set of files from the break-in cases, detailing more locations that had been targeted. The pattern was becoming clearer. These were not just random acts of vandalism or theft, they were calculated, aimed specifically at Black-owned businesses in some of the most economically vulnerable parts of the city. The perpetrators, whoever they were, had a particular agenda, and Esther's instincts told her this was no coincidence. As she meticulously combed through the details, a knock at the door broke her concentration. It was Santos, his face unreadable as usual, but with a touch of something else in his demeanor, something more urgent. "Esther, I need you to come with me," he said, his tone grave. Esther followed him down the long hallway, toward the briefing room. The atmosphere around her felt charged, like the agency itself was holding its breath. When they reached the room, she found several senior agents already assembled, including Director Harris. The moment she stepped inside, all eyes turned to her. "Esther," Director Harris began, "we have a new development regarding the break-ins." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. "There's a credible source that says we've got a group operating with ties to a larger, more dangerous network. We've just received intel that they're planning a major operation tonight." Esther felt a surge of adrenaline shoot through her. This was it, the break she had been waiting for. "What's the target?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the excitement rising in her chest. "There are 2 key locations, both Black-owned businesses, and we believe the group plans to make a public statement by hitting them simultaneously," Santos replied. Director Harris stepped forward, his expression firm. We need to act fast. This operation will be high profile. We need all hands on deck. Esther, we're assigning you to lead the tactical team tonight. For the first time in days, Esther felt a sense of clarity. This case, this mission, could be the turning point. It wasn't just about the criminals anymore, it was about sending a message that no matter how deep the prejudice ran, they would not let it take root in their city. This was a fight she had been preparing for all her life. The team briefed quickly. The plan was clear: coordinate with local law enforcement, set up surveillance, and make sure they had eyes on the targets in real time. There was no room for error. Esther ran through the logistics, making sure every team member knew their role, when and where to deploy, and how to handle any potential resistance. As the hours ticked by, the tension in the agency office grew thicker, and Esther's mind raced. It wasn't just about catching the criminals, it was personal. The idea of dismantling a group that targeted her community gave her the resolve to push through the exhaustion and emotional turmoil she had been battling. This mission would be her redemption, not only as an agent but as a Black woman who had been underestimated for far too long. By late evening, the team was assembled and ready. They left the office as the sun dipped below the horizon, and Esther could feel the weight of the city's pulse in the air. As they drove toward the operation's starting point, her phone buzzed. She didn't recognize the number, but the text message was unmistakable. Esther, it's Henry. I need to apologize. I've been thinking about what I did, and I can't live with it anymore. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I regret my actions deeply. Please, let me know when you're ready to talk. For a moment, Esther's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just an apology, it was an acknowledgement of the damage he had caused, a step toward understanding the deeper issues of racism that he had never confronted before. She felt the words sink in, and though part of her wanted to dismiss them entirely, another part of her, one that had been longing for validation and respect, felt a stir of something she couldn't name. But tonight wasn't the time for this. She couldn't afford to let her focus slip, not now, not when the operation was this close to going down. The text would have to wait. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and refocused on the task at hand. As they arrived at the first location, the scene was tense. Local police were already on site, the area cordoned off with yellow tape, and officers were working through the perimeter. Esther surveyed the situation, mentally running through the plan one last time. This is it, she said to the team, her voice sharp. No mistakes. We hit them hard and fast. Everyone stick to the plan. Let's get this done. The operation unfolded flawlessly. Esther's team moved with precision, securing both locations before the criminals had a chance to strike. The arrests were swift and effective, the perpetrators caught red-handed in their attempts to make a statement. The mission, which had been expected to erupt into violence, ended without a single shot fired. The criminals were taken into custody, and Esther stood there, watching as they were led away, knowing that they had just neutralized a dangerous group intent on spreading fear and division. But as she stood in the quiet aftermath, the buzz of accomplishment barely registered. She felt a strange emptiness inside, a hole that no victory could fill. The city had been spared for now, but the underlying issues, the prejudice and hatred, were still present. They always would be. As she packed up her gear and made her way back to the command center, her phone buzzed again. She pulled it out, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the new message from Henry. I'm sorry. I know it's not enough, but I hope you'll give me a chance to prove that I can do better. Esther stopped in her tracks. The weight of the past few days, the mission, the tension with Henry, felt overwhelming. For a moment, she allowed herself to pause, to think about what it all meant. She had spent so many years fighting to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. Was she ready to let go of the bitterness, to open herself up to the possibility of reconciliation? The night was still, and Esther stood alone in the quiet, her thoughts swirling. She realized that the battle she had fought that day, the one against the group targeting her community, was just one part of a much larger fight. The road to healing injustice was long and fraught with challenges. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Tomorrow, she would face Henry again, but today, she had won. The road to healing. The days following the operation were a blur of media reports, press conferences, and ongoing investigations. But for Esther, the real work was just beginning. As the department celebrated their success, she found herself quietly reflecting on the quiet, personal victories that had come with it, ones that didn't make the headlines. After the arrests were made, and the city had returned to a semblance of calm, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within her. For years, her entire existence had been a series of walls, a fortress built on the idea that her strength and resilience would protect her from the world's harsh judgments. But now, after facing down the criminals, and after receiving Henry's apology, Esther was beginning to question what she had been running from all these years. She had always been proud of her professionalism, of the walls she had erected to separate her work from her personal life. But the walls were starting to feel more like cages. The mission had taught her something she hadn't anticipated, that no matter how much you try to shield yourself from the ugliness of the world, the healing comes not from closing off, but from opening up. The first time she saw Henry again was a few days after the operation. He had asked to meet in person, and while her initial instinct was to decline, something within her told her that she owed it to herself to at least hear him out. They met in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, a place that was far removed from the intensity of their usual professional environments. As Esther walked in, she spotted Henry sitting at a corner table, his posture stiff and his eyes shadowed with the weight of regret. She could feel the tension between them even before she sat down. There were so many words unsaid, so many things that needed to be addressed. Henry stood as she approached, his face softening when their eyes met. He looked older than she remembered, wearier, and there was a humility in his expression that she hadn't expected. "Esther," he said softly, as if he was uncertain of how to begin. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." She nodded but didn't speak immediately. Instead, she took a seat and studied him carefully, trying to make sense of the man in front of her. There had been a time when she would have dismissed him outright, but something in his demeanor made her hesitate. The apology hadn't felt like a token gesture, it had been a sincere attempt to make things right, and that demanded a different kind of response. "What do you want from me, Henry?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "I can't undo the past, and I don't expect you to either." "I know," he replied, his voice tinged with regret. "I don't expect that. I can't take back the harm I caused you, and I'll never be able to make up for it. But what I do want, what I need, is a chance to show you that I'm willing to change. I'm trying to understand how I can do better, how I can truly be part of the solution, not just a bystander." Esther stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his words settling in. It was more than she had expected. She had imagined a defensive response, an explanation, an excuse. But instead, Henry was speaking the language of accountability, something that was rarely offered in their world of power dynamics and systems of control. "I don't know what you can do to make it right," she said slowly, her voice steady but her heart uncertain. "But if you're willing to try, then I guess that's a place to start." The conversation that followed wasn't easy. They talked about their shared history, about the professional challenges they had both faced, but also about the deeper issues that neither had fully acknowledged until now. Henry opened up about his upbringing, his own struggles with race and privilege, and how he had never truly examined the ways in which his actions, or inactions, had perpetuated systemic inequality. "I never saw it," he admitted. "I was part of the problem, Esther. I had the privilege of not having to see it. But now, I can't unsee it. And I don't want to. I just don't know how to fix it." Esther nodded, understanding his frustration, the same frustration she had felt many times in her own life. The struggle of wanting to change the world, but feeling helpless to do so. "It's not going to be easy," she told him. "And it's not going to happen overnight. But change happens when we start having these hard conversations. When we're willing to listen, not just to hear, but to understand." The conversation ended with no grand resolution, but it was a beginning. A beginning that was as uncertain as it was hopeful. They didn't leave the cafe with any illusions that things would be perfect from then on. But they left with something more important, a shared understanding that the road to reconciliation, though long and arduous, was worth traveling. The weeks that followed saw subtle changes in Esther's approach to her work. She found herself less inclined to close herself off, to hide her true thoughts and feelings behind professional detachment. She still remained focused, still determined to fight for justice, but she also began to embrace the vulnerability that came with being human. She reached out to others, forming deeper connections with her colleagues and even the communities she served. Henry, too, did his part. He committed to attending diversity and inclusion seminars, reaching out to leaders in marginalized communities to better understand their struggles, and using his position to advocate for real, systemic change within the department. He wasn't perfect, and Esther wasn't under any illusion that he would immediately transform, but he was trying. And sometimes, that was all one could ask for. The case against the criminal group targeting Black-owned businesses was far from over. But with their arrest, the city had sent a strong message. Esther had led her team with courage and conviction, but she knew the fight was far from over. There were still battles to be fought on multiple fronts, and she would be there, on the front lines, fighting for a city that could one day truly see her and all the others like her, not just for what they could do, but for who they were. One night, as she sat on her apartment balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, Esther found herself reflecting on her journey. She had faced many challenges, both external and internal, and while she had fought tooth and nail for every step of progress, she had also begun to understand that the journey wasn't just about battling adversaries. It was about healing. It was about forging connections that would last, breaking down barriers, and offering grace where it was least expected. In that quiet moment, Esther knew that the road ahead would never be easy. But it was a road worth traveling, because it was the road to something better, a world where people like her could be seen, understood, and respected, not just for their achievements, but for the fullness of who they were.